The crisp January air settled over Washington, D.C., as thousands gathered on the National Mall, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath visible against the cold. The sea of red hats and American flags painted the landscape, a crowd eager to witness the moment they had been waiting for, the return of Donald J. Trump to the presidency. The grand spectacle unfolded with all the pomp and ceremony expected of a presidential inauguration. A military band played, dignitaries lined the stage, and cameras panned across the gathered elites, politicians, business tycoons, and cultural influencers. Among them stood Elon Musk, clad in a sharp navy blue suit, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. The world's richest man had positioned himself at the epicenter of power once again. As the oath of office was administered, the crowd roared. The air buzzed with anticipation, the triumph of a movement solidified once more. Then came the national anthem. The audience rose in unison, hands placed dutifully over hearts, heads held high. The cameras, ever watchful, moved across the platform, capturing the faces of America's most powerful men and women in this historic moment. And then it happened. Elon Musk, standing confidently among the gathered figures, raised his arm. The gesture, executed with mechanical precision, was unmistakable. A stiff, extended arm salute, held for a second too long. The broadcast lingered on him, the camera hesitating as if uncertain whether to pan away. But it had already been seen. For a heartbeat, the entire stage seemed frozen in time, the ceremony continuing around Musk as if he were operating in a different reality. Then the camera moved on, the live feed cutting to a wide shot of the crowd, as though trying to erase what had just happened. But it was too late. Screenshots had already flooded social media. The reaction was immediate. News anchors hesitated mid-sentence as the clip replayed in real time. Twitter exploded, hashtags forming like wildfire, hashtag Musk salute, hashtag Elon exposed, hashtag Nazigate. The most generous interpretations were confusion or disbelief. Some speculated it was a bizarre joke. Others insisted it had to be an AI-manipulated deepfake. But the footage was unedited, the gesture clear. Within minutes, responses poured in. Historians, journalists, and political analysts dissected the movement, juxtaposing Musk's salute against archival footage from the 1930s and 40s. It was undeniable. The man celebrated for revolutionizing electric vehicles and space travel had, on the world's most watched stage, performed the salute of the very ideology the Allied forces had fought to erase. Musk, however, was undeterred. From his personal X, formerly Twitter, account, he responded with characteristic bravado. He dismissed the outrage as hysterical nonsense, claiming it was a misunderstanding, a Roman salute at best. The media lies, he posted, followed by an eye-roll emoji. In a later tweet, he accused journalists of attempting to cancel him, mocking what he called woke overreaction. His defenders mobilized instantly. Right-wing pundits flooded the airwaves with explanations, bending over backward to frame the gesture as harmless. Some claimed Musk had merely been adjusting his sleeve. Others speculated he had been reaching for a handshake that never arrived. The most absurd theories suggested he was shielding his eyes from the sun, though the overcast sky told another story. But the pushback was stronger. Historians and veterans came forward, their voices heavy with outrage. Those who had witnessed the rise of fascism firsthand, those who had fought against its horrors, would not let this moment slide. The footage was broadcast across international news networks, from the BBC to Al Jazeera, from CNN to state-run Russian and Chinese media, each drawing their own conclusions. Tesla's stock took a hit within hours, investors growing uneasy with the association. SpaceX partners issued quiet statements of concern. Advertisers debated pulling their contracts. The cracks in Musk's invulnerability had finally begun to show. As the news cycle raged on, the world watched, waiting for the moment that someone, anyone, would hold him accountable. Frank Monroe sat in his small living room, the flickering glow of the television reflecting off his weathered face. His hands, veined and gnarled with time, rested motionless on his lap as he watched the footage loop on the screen. Again and again, the same moment, Elon Musk, standing at the heart of American power, raising his arm in a gesture Frank had seen before, 80 years earlier, across an ocean, in places of death and despair. The past had never truly left Frank. Even at 99, the memories remained vivid, the acrid smell of burning flesh, the skeletal faces of prisoners staring through barbed wire, the silence of men too weak to cry. He had been there when the gates of Dachau had been opened, when the true weight of what he and his fellow soldiers had been fighting against became undeniable. He had looked into the hollow eyes of the survivors, and he had sworn, with every fiber of his being, that the world would never forget. And yet, here it was, happening in broad daylight, on the grandest stage of democracy. Not from some fringe radical in a dimly lit basement, but from one of the most powerful men in the world. The disgust churned in his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades, not since he had stood in a courtroom, testifying against a Nazi officer who had overseen mass executions. It had been years since he had spoken publicly about the war, choosing instead to live a quiet life, tending to his garden, enjoying visits from his grandchildren, trying to believe that the world he had fought for was one worth leaving behind. But now, silence felt like complicity. The decision came swiftly, an old soldier's instinct kicking in. He reached for the phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. Within hours, word had spread. A press conference was set. The last surviving members of his regiment, men now in their 90s, called to offer their support. The American Legion reached out, promising to stand beside him. The moment was no longer just his, it belonged to history, to every man who had bled in the snow and sand to crush the ideology that Musk had so brazenly mimicked. When the day arrived, the world watched. The conference hall was packed, reporters jostling for space, cameras fixed on the frail yet unbowed figure at the podium. Frank stood tall despite the weight of his years, his uniform jacket adorned with the medals he had earned in a war that had cost him more than just his youth. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the podium, but his voice, when it came, was steady. He spoke of what it had meant to fight against fascism, not the sanitized version found in history books, but the reality of it. He recounted the bitter cold of the Ardennes, the gunfire that had ripped through his friends, the horrors unveiled when the camps were liberated. He described the men and women they had found, the walking corpses who had clung to their hands, whispering thanks in languages they did not understand. The room was silent as he continued, the weight of his words pressing against the assembled crowd. He did not need to raise his voice to convey his fury. He did not need dramatics to make his point. The truth alone was enough. What Musk had done was not a misunderstanding, not a harmless gesture blown out of proportion. It was a disgrace. It was an insult to the men who had died fighting against the very symbol he had so casually imitated. It was a reminder that history, no matter how often it was documented, could still be ignored, twisted, or forgotten. The impact was immediate. Veterans organizations issued statements of condemnation. Holocaust memorial institutions called for accountability. The footage of Frank's speech spread like wildfire, juxtaposed against Musk's now infamous salute. The contrast was undeniable, one man who had faced evil and fought to eradicate it, and another who, through arrogance or malice, had resurrected its shadow. Public sentiment, already teetering, shifted further. Musk's defenders grew quieter, their justifications sounding increasingly hollow in the face of living history. Investors reconsidered their positions. Advertisers distanced themselves. And for the first time in his career, Musk, a man who had thrived on controversy, who had built an empire on defying the rules, was beginning to face consequences. Frank, however, had no interest in social media trends or corporate statements. He had done what needed to be done, spoken the truth when it mattered. As he stepped away from the podium, helped gently by one of his grandsons, he allowed himself a single thought. The fight was not yet over. But neither was he. The backlash against Elon Musk had been swift, but it was his own arrogance that turned the crisis into a catastrophe. Rather than retreating, reflecting, or even attempting a calculated apology, he did what he had always done: he doubled down. Within hours of Frank Monroe's speech, Musk took to social media, unleashing a flurry of dismissive posts. He mocked the 99-year-old veteran, branding him senile and suggesting he was merely a pawn for the woke mob. He accused mainstream media of manufacturing outrage, painting himself as the real victim in a world that no longer understood nuance. He sarcastically referred to his own gesture as totally fascist guise, laced with mockery and a cavalier attitude that only inflamed the situation further. But this time, it was different. For years, Musk had thrived on controversy, weaponizing his influence to ridicule critics and rally his fiercely loyal following. Yet, this time, the weight of history stood against him. Frank Monroe was not just another public figure. He was a living reminder of what had once been fought and won, a man whose words carried the weight of millions who never returned home. The sight of Musk dismissing such a figure with crude derision sparked an outrage unlike anything he had faced before. The fallout was immediate. Veterans organizations across the country condemned him. The American Legion issued a scathing statement, while Holocaust remembrance groups demanded accountability. Even conservative-leaning outlets, which had often defended Musk in previous controversies, struggled to rationalize his actions. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about something far deeper, something that transcended party lines, a fundamental understanding of right and wrong. Then came the financial blow. Tesla's stock, already wobbly from market uncertainty, took a sharp nosedive as major institutional investors announced they were reconsidering their positions. A prominent pension fund liquidated its holdings, citing ethical concerns. Advertisers quietly pulled away, reluctant to associate their brands with the growing controversy. At SpaceX, government partners and military contractors began re-evaluating their deals. NASA, which had long collaborated with Musk's company, faced mounting pressure to sever ties. Internal murmurs suggested that key figures within the agency were actively seeking alternatives. Musk's once unshakable dominance in the private space industry no longer seemed guaranteed. The corporate world, too, began to distance itself. Prominent business leaders who had once celebrated Musk's genius now avoided his name. Conference invitations were rescinded. Panels quietly replaced him with less volatile figures. Celebrities who had once hailed him as a visionary either condemned his actions or erased their previous praise. Even some of his most ardent supporters began to question whether his latest outburst had finally crossed the line. And then, the legal troubles started. Rumors surfaced that the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, had taken an interest in Musk's erratic behavior. His social media posts had long been a regulatory headache, but now, with investors losing millions in real time due to his reckless outbursts, pressure mounted for official intervention. A new probe into possible market manipulation was floated, and murmurs of legal repercussions grew louder. Behind the scenes, there was chaos. Tesla's board of directors scrambled to contain the damage, while executives at SpaceX held emergency meetings. Employees, many of whom had long tolerated Musk's antics as the cost of working for a tech giant, now openly expressed discomfort. Some even resigned in protest, their departures making headlines of their own. Musk, however, refused to back down. His tweets grew more erratic, his grievances more unhinged. He ranted about free speech, about media corruption, about how the world simply couldn't handle his brilliance. The more he lashed out, the more his empire crumbled beneath him. For years, he had been untouchable, a modern-day Icarus soaring toward the sun. Now, with the weight of history against him and the pillars of his empire beginning to crack, the inevitable was becoming clear. Elon Musk was finally falling. The town hall had been arranged as part of Musk's frantic attempt at damage control. His advisors had insisted that he needed to face the public, to humanize himself, to move past the scandal that refused to die. The idea was simple: take questions, appear composed, and remind the world why he had once been admired. But the atmosphere in the studio was anything but forgiving. The event was broadcast live, with an audience that was carefully curated but still unpredictable. Reporters filled the front rows, their pens poised to record any misstep. The country watched with bated breath. Musk, usually brimming with self-assured bravado, walked onto the stage with a forced grin. The once unshakable aura of invincibility had been chipped away. His empire was faltering, his influence waning. Among the audience sat Frank Monroe. His presence had not been announced. Few even knew he had agreed to attend. But there he was, seated in the third row, his frail form dwarfed by the chair, his face a mask of quiet resolve. Time had worn him thin, but his eyes still held the fire of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and lived to tell about it. The questions began, each one sharper than Musk had expected. He deflected, he rationalized, he played the victim. But the room was no longer under his control. The tide had shifted, and the world was no longer content to simply watch him talk his way out of another scandal. Then, the microphone was passed to Frank. The audience stilled as the veteran struggled to rise, assisted by a younger man at his side. The movement was slow, deliberate, each second stretching into eternity. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the etched lines of his face, the medals that still adorned his jacket, the sheer weight of history sitting upon his shoulders. And then, he spoke. His voice, though aged, carried through the room with a clarity that silenced everything else. He spoke of sacrifice, of the men who had stormed beaches and fallen in trenches so that men like Musk could stand on stages like this, free and unburdened. He recounted the horrors he had seen, the graves, the camps, the victims whose voices had been stolen before they could tell their stories. He reminded the audience of what had been fought for, of what had been promised in the aftermath of that war, never again. He turned to Musk, his gaze unflinching, and he delivered the words that would define the night. Musk, for the first time in his public life, had no response. His usual smirks, his deflections, his witty retorts, none of them surfaced. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against his chair, his eyes darting toward his handlers as if searching for a way out. But there was none. The room belonged to Frank now. The silence was deafening. The audience, the reporters, the viewers at home, everyone felt the gravity of the moment. There was no spin, no distraction that could undo what had just happened. Frank Monroe had spoken, and his words carried more weight than all of Musk's billions. By the time the broadcast ended, the speech had already gone viral. Clips spread across the internet, shared by politicians, historians, activists, and ordinary citizens alike. The words became a rallying cry, a defining moment in the fight against modern fascism. And Musk, for all his wealth, for all his influence, could do nothing but watch as his empire continued to crumble. The fallout from Frank Monroe's speech was immediate and irreversible. The moment had transcended politics, finance, and even Musk's own cult of personality. It was no longer just about a single gesture or an old man's condemnation. It had become a reckoning. The world had finally tired of Elon Musk. Within hours, the clip of Frank's words had been replayed across every major network, dissected in articles, and transformed into a symbol of defiance. Social media, which had once been Musk's greatest weapon, turned against him. The hashtags that had trended in defense of him evaporated, replaced by words that would follow him for the rest of his life. Hashtag Musk disgrace, hashtag never again, hashtag Frank Monroe truth. Tesla's stock collapsed under the weight of mass sell-offs. The company's board, already strained from weeks of crisis, convened in emergency meetings as investors demanded action. One by one, partnerships unraveled, banks re-evaluated loans, suppliers renegotiated terms, and previously loyal shareholders fled. SpaceX faced an even harsher reality. Government contracts, once guaranteed, were put on hold. Military officials distanced themselves, wary of associating national defense with a man now labeled as a sympathizer of the very ideology they had sworn to oppose. NASA, long a key ally, began exploring alternative partnerships, signaling that Musk's influence in space exploration had reached its expiration. The exodus was not limited to finance. Public figures who had once celebrated Musk as a genius turned their backs. Universities revoked speaking invitations. Tech conferences removed him from their lineups. The once sycophantic press, which had spent years feeding into the myth of his invulnerability, now eagerly chronicled his collapse. Facing insurmountable pressure, Musk resigned from Tesla's board. The announcement was made with none of his usual bravado. There was no grand defiant speech, no meme-laden post to spin the situation in his favor. He was, for the first time, truly defeated. The world moved on quickly. Without Musk's constant provocations, the media landscape shifted. New innovators emerged, untainted by scandal. His name became a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when arrogance met accountability. But while Musk faded, Frank Monroe's legacy only grew. His words were etched into history, replayed in classrooms and quoted in political speeches. His speech became required viewing in Holocaust education programs, a reminder that history was not an abstract concept but something that still lived, still breathed, still demanded vigilance. Memorials were erected in his honor. His image, frail yet resolute at that town hall, was immortalized in museums and textbooks. Schools and libraries bore his name, ensuring that his message would not be forgotten. When Frank passed away a few months later, the world mourned. His funeral was attended by veterans, historians, and dignitaries from around the globe. Flags were lowered in his honor. The president spoke of his courage. The last surviving soldiers from his regiment stood in salute, their ranks thinned by time but their loyalty unshaken. As the sun set on the day of his burial, people across the world reflected on the man who had stood for truth when it mattered most. Elon Musk, meanwhile, lived on in obscurity, stripped of relevance. His empire had crumbled, his reputation beyond repair. The world had lost a false idol, but it had gained a true hero.